Hello, Royals, to the members of the faculty and staff of this great university, students. Thank you for the invitation to share with you today. I'm actually going to be sharing a video from a message that I spoke on the commemoration, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The message was entitled, "Out of a Mountain of Despair, a Stone of Hope," which is actually the inscription on the National Memorial for Dr. King in Washington, D.C. As you view and listen to this message, my call to action, my challenge for you is to consider yourselves. Dr. King was a student and a young man when he was seized by history. And I'm just stubborn enough to believe in the midst of the despair that we have, whether it's the pandemic or social unrest, the political climate that faces both our country and our world, that a contribution can still be made by each of us. We do commemorate the passing of Dr. Martin Luther King, which happened 50 years ago tonight. But it's hopeful because he spoke of a hope that was far greater than himself. And when I think about Dr. King, I think about the fact that he literally gave his life to serve others. And oftentimes we create heroes and sheroes out of folks, but in reality, Dr. King was really just a person like you and I, a person that at the age of 15, he had already suffered from so much depression that he actually attempted suicide twice. And so tonight, I want to honor him to suggest that we are locked in solidarity, the opportunity to carry out that dream. And as I was thinking about what I would talk about tonight, I had to stop and realize that Dr. King was felled by an assassin's bullet 50 years ago tonight, and he was 39 when that happened, and I'm 39. And I thought to myself, what have I done with my life? Dr. King decided that he would give his life to the cause of racial equity, racial justice, human rights, what we at the time called civil rights in America. And I just want to give a brief timeline just to catch us all up. It really started in 1954 when Dr. King became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Young 20-something, now he's the pastor. And there were a couple of catalytic events that really spurred him into being seized by history. The next thing, or the first thing of these three catalytic events was that same year, in 1954, there was this Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education, where it overturned a previous decision of Plessy versus Ferguson that said, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate could be equal. Minorities in this country and those that were a part of the majority culture actually could have separate facilities and they could be equal. But Brown versus Board of Education determined that the separate facilities were not equal, and a young Thurgood Marshall, who later became the Supreme Court Justice, led the cause, and that decision of separate but equal was overturned. First catalytic event. Second thing that happened was this 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till, as Dr. King was really trying to figure out how he's going to pastor. He's in this community in Montgomery, but there was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois, named Emmett Till, who traveled down to Mississippi to be with his family. And when he was down in Mississippi, he went into a convenience store, and a Caucasian lady said that Emmett whistled at her. So 4 days later, some of the people that lady knew caught up with Emmett Till in Mississippi, and they brutalized him, they drugged him, and murdered him. It was so devastating that when his body got back to Chicago, his mother couldn't recognize him and decided to have his casket opened so that the entire world could see what had been done to her son because of the color of his skin. Incidentally, the lady who claimed that Emmett whistled at her recently passed away, and she recanted her story. His image of an open casket, unrecognizable, was plastered on the front pages of many papers, including the Chicago Defender, and that spurred on this movement for civil rights and human rights. That happened August 28th. Use that as a footnote. The third thing that happened was this young seamstress named Rosa who decided that she would stand up by sitting down. She no longer felt that she should move to the back of a bus just because of the color of her skin. And so that launched the Montgomery Bus Boycott movement. So those three things, Brown versus Board of Education, the death of Emmett Till, and then young Rosa deciding that she would refuse to give up her seat. And so King, now leading the Montgomery Bus Boycott because he's a young pastor in Montgomery, now has to make a decision, what am I going to do? And in April of 1963, Easter, he decides to write some of his white clergy brothers and compel them to link arm in arm with him to help overcome the systemic injustice and to join this movement. He wrote this letter from a Birmingham jail. Then, in May of that same year, there was this children's crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, where children decided that they would link arms for their own plight as they're going through this wilderness period and they're searching to get to the promised land, but pit bulls were sicked on them and fire hoses were turned on them. Then in August of that year, Dr. King decided, along with many others, that there should be a march in Washington, D.C. for jobs and freedom. And if you don't know anything about Dr. King, you probably know that at some point he had a dream. And his dream that day was really for all of God's children, white people and black and brown people, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, to be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood and laugh together and go to school together and to work together and to go to church together. Here's another way to say it. He really was trying to bring about racial reconciliation, racial equity, racial justice. And as I really understand this whole concept of racism, it's based in America on someone's skin and ethnicity, and skin is all a farce. This concept of race, it's not true, it's a farce. Our skin is determined by melanin. The hue of our skin is determined based upon the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And if your ancestors lived thousands of years ago closer to the equator or further away from the tropical regions, that is what determined the color of your skin. And as migration took place, there were people that were in colder climates that moved to warmer climates, and thousands of years later, their skin went from white to dark, and so their ancestors actually looked a little bit more like me. This idea, this concept of being divided because one person is golden brown like me and another person might look a little peach, it's such a farce. But in almost every industrialized nation on earth, people have lost their lives because of race and class. Here's another way to say it. Dr. King, on that particular day, when he spoke about this dream where we would have equity, he really was just trying to say that if you look at an egg, and sometimes we have a white egg and a brown egg, the reality is there is no physiological difference between the two eggs. The white egg and the brown egg, when you crack them open, there's the same thing on the inside. Now, brown and red chickens, they hatch brown eggs, and the white chickens, they hatch the white eggs. And sometimes when we go to the grocer, the brown eggs are a little bit more expensive, but that's only because the brown chickens, they often eat a little bit more because their food tastes a little better. And it's often seasoned a little better, you know, with a little... you guys get the point. And so they pass that cost along to the consumer, but there's no difference on the inside. Here's what Dr. King was really saying, as I understood it. He really was saying that there are three levels of equality versus equity. On this first side, you see that everyone can't see the field. And it's because there's a person that has a little bit more of a privilege than the other person. And so the people that say that we should all have the same box, that's equality. And it seems like it's the right thing. But if at the end of the day, everybody still doesn't have access to the field, that doesn't work for the people that aren't privileged. The second one is justice. And the second one says that the shorter fella, he really should have a few more boxes. But to those that have been privileged to do the second portion, which is justice, that really seems like oppression to the person who had the greater access from the beginning. And so the reality is, what we really want is equity, to remove the barriers so that we all can have access to the field. The good news is, after that, 1963, there was this Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965. And that protected the rights of citizens, regardless of their skin color, to be able to vote without the discriminatory practices that prevented them from voting. And so there's some good news, because there's more gender equity even as it relates to Congress. About 19% of the congressional seats are held by women. There is some good news, even though there's still a disproportionate amount of Caucasian folks that hold the powerful positions in Congress. Congress is becoming more and more representative of our entire population, so that everyone has access. There is some good news. 55 years after the March on Washington, when Dr. King said that he had a dream, 55 years after, there's access that we didn't previously have. 55 years ago, when the March on Washington took place, black and brown people couldn't go to a public water fountain, couldn't go to a public restroom. They couldn't get accommodations at a public hotel. 55 years ago, when the March on Washington took place, there were a lot of things that just couldn't happen, but there has been some good news, and I'm grateful for progress. I'm really grateful for progress. Today, 91% of Americans support criminal justice reform because we realize that we are living in the most incarcerated nation on earth, and it really should not be. And the majority of people that are incarcerated are black and brown people, far more affected than any other race. But there's still work to do, because 4 in 10 African Americans believe that there may be a promised land of racial equity, harmony, and unity, but it's not one that they will see in their lifetime. There's still work to do, because stats suggest that by the year 2044, the majority of Americans will be what's considered now to be the minority class. And even though the majority of Americans will be minority by 2044, the wealth gap in America is so exaggerated that 10 years later, 2050s, that the median household wealth for African Americans will actually be zero. Here's a chart that shows the trajectory of where it is now. The median household wealth by race and ethnicity. Just looking at Latino Americans and African Americans as compared to our white brothers and sisters. There's still work to do. And the trajectory shows that by 2050, the wealth for African Americans will be zero, and a few years later for our Latinx brothers and sisters, it will be zero. There's work to do. And so, if you say, what can I do to link arm in arm with Dr. King and his dream, here are 4 B's that I want to give you.